Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But here's the problem. Land does not have supply chains. Out of reach for another family. Exactly. They're spending all kinds of money to make housing more expensive for taxpayers and home buyers. Why does Canada, with among the most abundant supply of land in the entire world, have the second worst housing bubble in the world? Is it just inflation?
The Honourable Minister. Member for Carleton.
So let's get this straight. When Conservatives were in power, according to him, we spent $250 million on housing, and the average house cost Canadians $450 grand. Now, with them in power, they're spending $27 billion tax dollars, and the average house costs $720 grand. So now housing is not just more expensive for taxpayers, it's more expensive for home buyers. Failing is bad, Mr. Speaker. Failing expensively is even worse. Mr. Speaker, why do we have the second biggest housing bubble in the world?
The Honourable Minister.
Can see through that partisan rhetoric, Mr. Speaker. Here are the facts. The fact is they invested $0 in COBs. They downloaded housing costs to municipalities and provinces. The reason we have a housing crisis is because they had no leadership in housing for their time in office. Here's the fact. We brought in federal leadership in housing. We've introduced the National Housing Strategy. We're working more than ever before with municipalities. And we're bringing in a first-time home buyer incentive to make sure that we're turning Canadians into home buyers.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
He seems to be bragging that he's the most expensive housing minister in Canadian history, because not only are Canadians spending more when they buy a house, now they have to pay more on their taxes for the failed programs that this minister and this government put in place to inflate the housing bubble to begin with. Canada has the second biggest housing bubble in the world, behind a tiny island in the South Pacific called New Zealand. Every other country has less housing inflation. So what is causing this massive bubble? Is it just inflation?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, since the member from Carleton has referred to inflation, let's do a little bit of fact-checking of what we heard in the House earlier today. The member for Louis Saint Laurent referred to Germany having higher inflation than Canada. So I'd like to urge the honourable members to check their facts before they come into this House, because this morning Germany reported 6% inflation. The Eurozone this morning reported 4.9% inflation. Even the leader of the Conservatives has admitted he understands inflation is a global phenomenon. I wish other members of his party would listen to him sometimes.
Member for Carleton.
Well, listen, maybe the Prime Minister would listen to the Deputy Prime Minister's book, and in that book, she could explain how she has managed to create the second biggest housing bubble in the world. In fact, Vancouver has the second highest home prices on Earth. Toronto is number 5, more expensive than Manhattan, San Francisco, London, England, other places with far less land, far more people, and far more money. This is housing inflation that has resulted since this government unleashed a torrent of money printing. So, will this finance minister finally tell us what is causing this housing bubble? Is it just inflation?
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if the Conservatives really disagree with Stephen Pallose, appointed by Stephen Harper as Governor of the Bank of Canada, and they really believe that COVID was the time for austerity, it's time for them to come clean with Canadians and talk about what they would have cut. Would they have cut the CERB that supported 9 million Canadians who lost their jobs? Would they have cut the wage subsidy that supported 450,000 employers, keeping 5.3 million hardworking people on the payroll? Or would they have cut CEBA that supported nearly 900,000 businesses? Canadians need to know.
That's right.
I just want to remind the honourable members that I do have a clock in front and I can tell the time. I appreciate the help that they're trying to give me, but I do have that here.
Our economy ground to a halt with 0.3% economic growth. How could so much money buy so little?
Stephen Harper and the Conservatives.
Headlong into inflation. We have to face reality. What the government needs to start by doing is something it hasn't done for 6 years. Limit spending. Will the government finally limit spending? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the main economic priority for Canada is to put this pandemic behind us. We need to do everything we can to end COVID-19, which is causing major harms throughout our economy and throughout the world.
For Burnaby South.
Canadians are faced with a housing crisis that is striking hard on all Canadians across the country. It is so difficult for anyone to find a home that's in their budget. The previous and the former governor of the Bank of Canada states really clearly that the federal government has a role in tackling this housing crisis. We agree. The federal government needs to tackle the pressures driving up the cost of housing through speculation and address the supply side issue by building more homes that people can actually afford. People are desperately in need of help. Why is this Prime Minister not responding to this crisis with the urgency necessary?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, as outlined in the speech from the throne, housing is a major priority for this government, and we will deliver. With programs like the Housing Accelerator Fund, which will help municipalities build more and better faster. Whether it's building more units per year or increasing affordable housing, we will work with partners to get real results for Canadian families.
Unfortunately for Canadians, Mr. Speaker, this government's inflationist policies aren't doing anything other than increase prices. France, Japan, the UK, Germany, and other countries are also facing COVID, but they're not seeing such high inflation as we are here in Canada. Once again, Mr. Speaker, I have a simple question. Will this government finally do what anyone responsible should do, which is to say limit spending, as it hasn't done for 6 years? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, these other countries mentioned by my colleague are also facing an inflation crisis.